The school cafeteria buzzed with lunchtime chatter. Plastic trays clattering, kids laughing, teachers pretending everything was normal. But it all fell silent the moment a tall man in a black coat stepped inside. Vincenzo Viper De Luca, the most feared mafia boss in the entire state. No one expected to see him at an elementary school, especially not during lunch. But today wasn't a normal visit. He was there because his daughter had come home the night before with swollen eyes, refusing to speak, refusing to eat, holding her backpack like a shield. He needed answers. The cafeteria manager tried to greet him, but he walked past her without a word. His eyes scanned the room until he saw her, his daughter, sitting alone, head down, shoulders shaking. And then he saw why. A teacher, her teacher, was towering over her, not guiding, not correcting, but snarling, her voice sharp enough to cut the air. "Eat it! I said eat it!" She slammed a plastic container onto the table, spilling cold food everywhere. The little girl flinched, tears dripping onto her untouched tray. Vincenzo froze. His blood turned to ice. He had seen betrayal in boardrooms. He had seen cruelty in the streets. He had seen violence from men who thought they were untouchable. But nothing prepared him for the sight of a grown adult terrorizing his daughter. The chair beneath him scraped loudly as he stepped forward. The teacher spun around, ready to discipline another child, until she saw him. The color drained from her face. The entire cafeteria held its breath, because the mafia boss wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't lifting a hand. He was just staring at her. And that was somehow more terrifying than anything he could have said. What happened next would change the entire school forever. Stay with me until the end, because what Vincenzo did next shook the entire district and exposed a secret the school had been hiding for years. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Vincenzo De Luca wasn't supposed to be at Millfield Elementary that Tuesday afternoon. He should have been across town, handling business that required his particular brand of persuasion. But sometimes life throws you a curveball that changes everything. It started 3 weeks earlier when his 8-year-old daughter Isabella began acting different. The girl who used to run to him with drawings and stories about her day suddenly became quiet. She stopped eating her favorite foods. She started having nightmares. At first, Vincenzo thought it was normal kid stuff. Maybe she was getting picked on by classmates. Maybe she missed her mother, who had passed away 2 years prior. He tried talking to her, but Isabella just shook her head and whispered that everything was fine. But Vincenzo De Luca didn't become the most powerful man in the state by ignoring his instincts. And his instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong. The breaking point came Monday night. Isabella had barely touched her dinner when she suddenly burst into tears. Not the usual tears of a frustrated child, but the deep, soul-crushing sobs of someone who had been carrying a terrible weight. "Baby, what's wrong?" Vincenzo knelt beside her chair, his voice softer than anyone in his organization had ever heard it. "You can tell Daddy anything." Isabella looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm bad. She says I make her job harder. She says maybe I should go to a different school where they know how to handle problem children." Vincenzo's jaw tightened. Mrs. Patterson was Isabella's third-grade teacher, a woman he'd met briefly during parent orientation. She seemed strict but professional. "What else does Mrs. Patterson say, sweetheart?" "She makes me sit by myself during lunch. She says I eat too slowly, and it disrupts the other children. She gives me the leftover food that nobody else wants. Sometimes it's cold. Sometimes it smells funny." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vincenzo had dealt with traitors, thieves, and killers, but hearing that someone was systematically humiliating his daughter made him see red in a way he'd never experienced. "Does she do this to other children too?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice calm. Isabella shook her head. "Just me. She says I'm special, but not the good kind of special, the kind that needs extra discipline." That night, after Isabella finally fell asleep, Vincenzo made some calls. Within an hour, he had detailed information about Mrs. Patterson. 43 years old, divorced, no children of her own, 22 years of teaching experience with a spotless record. Too spotless, actually. In 22 years, not a single parent complaint had been filed against her. Not one disciplinary action, not even a minor reprimand. That kind of perfect record usually meant one of two things. Either she was genuinely exceptional, or she was very good at covering her tracks. Vincenzo decided to find out which one it was. The next morning, he told his lieutenant Marcus that he'd be unavailable for a few hours. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but knew better than to ask questions when the boss had that particular look in his eyes. Vincenzo arrived at Millfield Elementary just as lunch period began. The school's front office was typical suburban chaos. Phones ringing, kids getting picked up early for doctor appointments, teachers rushing back and forth with papers. The secretary, a pleasant woman in her 50s, looked up when he entered. "Good afternoon, can I help you? I'm here to observe my daughter's lunch period," Vincenzo said, showing his identification. Isabella DeLuca, 3rd grade. The secretary's smile faltered slightly. She'd obviously heard his name before, probably in whispered conversations among the staff. "Of course, Mr. DeLuca. The cafeteria is just down the hall. Would you like someone to escort you?" "That won't be necessary." He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Children's artwork decorated the walls. Finger paintings, book reports, science projects. Normal kid stuff that should have filled him with pride for his daughter's school. Instead, all he could think about was Isabella's tear-streaked face the night before. The cafeteria doors were propped open, and he could hear the familiar sounds of lunchtime before he even entered. Kids chattering, milk cartons being opened, the clatter of plastic utensils against trays. He paused at the entrance, taking in the scene. Long tables filled with children, most of them laughing and talking with their friends. Teachers moving between the tables, helping open difficult packages, wiping up spills, maintaining order with gentle authority. And then he saw Isabella. She was sitting alone at a small table in the corner, as far from the other children as possible. Her lunch tray contained what looked like yesterday's leftovers, a sad-looking sandwich, some brown apple slices, and milk that had clearly been sitting out too long. But it wasn't the food that made Vincenzo's blood boil. It was the woman standing over his daughter, arms crossed, face twisted with disgust. Mrs. Patterson. "I don't have all day, Isabella," the teacher was saying, her voice carrying across the cafeteria despite her obvious attempt to keep it low. "The other children finished their lunch 10 minutes ago. You're holding everyone up." Isabella's small hands trembled as she tried to take a bite of the stale sandwich. She chewed slowly, struggling to swallow, her eyes fixed on the table. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Mrs. Patterson snapped. "Do you see how the other children behave? Do you see how they eat their food without making a production out of it?" Isabella lifted her head, and Vincenzo could see the fear in her eyes even from across the room. The same fear he'd seen in grown men who owed him money they couldn't pay. That's when Mrs. Patterson made her fatal mistake. She grabbed the plastic container of what looked like old soup and slammed it down on the table, causing the contents to splash across Isabella's tray and onto her clothes. "Eat it! I said eat it!" Isabella flinched so hard she nearly fell off her chair. Tears started streaming down her face as she stared at the mess now covering her lunch and her shirt. And that's when every person in the cafeteria noticed that the room had gone completely silent. Because Vincenzo Viper DeLuca had just stepped into their world, and nothing would ever be the same. Would ever be the same. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in the city knew that face, that presence, that aura of controlled danger that followed Vincenzo DeLuca wherever he went. "Mr. DeLuca," she stammered, trying to compose herself. "What a surprise to see you here. I was just helping Isabella with her lunch habits." Sometimes children need a firm hand to learn proper eating etiquette. Vincenzo said nothing. He simply walked toward the table where his daughter sat, her small frame trembling as she stared at the ruined food scattered across her tray. The other children in the cafeteria had stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped breathing. Even the lunch ladies had frozen in place behind the serving counter. "Isabella," Vincenzo said softly, kneeling down beside her chair. "Look at me, baby." His daughter slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. The fear there nearly broke his heart. But what destroyed him completely was the shame. She was ashamed, as if this humiliation was somehow her fault. "Did you do something wrong?" he asked gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. Isabella shook her head quickly. "I was eating, Daddy. I was trying to eat. But the food tastes bad, and my tummy hurts, and Mrs. Patterson said I was being difficult again." "Again?" Vincenzo's voice remained calm, but anyone who knew him would recognize the deadly undertone. "How many times has this happened, sweetheart?" "Every day," Isabella whispered. "Every single day since school started." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. DeLuca, perhaps we should discuss this in private. Children can sometimes exaggerate situations, and I'm sure Isabella doesn't mean to cause trouble, but she does require additional guidance with her behavior." Vincenzo stood up slowly, his full height casting a shadow over the teacher. "Additional guidance? Is that what you call this?" He picked up the plastic container that had been slammed down moments before. The soup inside was stone cold, with a film of grease floating on top. He could smell that it had gone bad days ago. "You're feeding my daughter rotten food." "That's not rotten. It's just yesterday's soup. We can't waste food here, Mr. DeLuca. We teach children to be grateful for what they have." "Yesterday's soup." Vincenzo repeated the words like he was tasting something bitter. "Tell me, Mrs. Patterson, what did you have for lunch today?" The teacher blinked rapidly. "I brought a salad from home." "But that's not relevant to—" "Show me." "Excuse me? Show me your lunch." Mrs. Patterson's face reddened. "I don't see how my personal meal choices have anything to do with Isabella's discipline issues." Vincenzo turned to look at the other tables. Children were eating fresh sandwiches, warm soup, fruit cups, chocolate milk. Their trays looked nothing like what sat in front of his daughter. Why is Isabella's food different from everyone else's? Some children require special meal plans based on their behavior and attitude. Isabella has been disruptive during lunch periods, so she receives modified portions until she learns to appreciate what she's given. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that Vincenzo almost admired the skill. Almost. But he'd built his empire on reading people, on knowing when someone was trying to manipulate him, and Mrs. Patterson was trying very hard to manipulate him. "How long have you been a teacher?" he asked. 22 years. I've dedicated my life to educating children, Mr. DeLuca. Sometimes that requires tough love. 22 years. And in all that time, how many other children have required this special meal plan? Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "Well, every child is different. Isabella's situation is unique." "Unique how?" The teacher glanced around the cafeteria, suddenly aware that every adult in the room was listening to their conversation. The lunch ladies, the cafeteria manager, even the janitor mopping in the corner had stopped to watch. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in my classroom," Mrs. Patterson suggested, "away from the children." "No." Vincenzo's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We'll continue it right here, in front of everyone. Because apparently you thought it was appropriate to humiliate my daughter in front of everyone." He turned to address the cafeteria manager, a nervous woman in her 40s, who had been watching the exchange with growing alarm. "Ma'am, what's your name?" Carol Hendricks. I manage the lunch program here." "Carol, how long has Mrs. Patterson been giving my daughter spoiled food?" Carol's eyes darted between Vincenzo and Mrs. Patterson. I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "Don't lie to me, Carol. I can tell when people are lying. It's part of my profession." "How long?" The woman's shoulders sagged. "Since the beginning of the school year. Mrs. Patterson told us Isabella had special dietary restrictions, said her father requested that she receive smaller portions, and yesterday's leftovers to teach her gratitude." Vincenzo felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. I never requested any such thing. But Mrs. Patterson said you specifically asked for. Mrs. Patterson lied. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone from red to pale white. She knew she'd been caught. And worse, she knew exactly who had caught her. There's been a misunderstanding, she said quickly. I may have miscommunicated Isabella's needs to the lunch staff. These things happen in busy schools. Miscommunicated. Vincenzo tasted the word. For 3 months. He walked back to Isabella's table and picked up the tray of ruined food. The bread was moldy around the edges. The milk was warm and chunky. The apple slices had turned brown and soft. This is what you've been feeding my 8-year-old daughter. Every day. For 3 months. Mrs. Patterson opened her mouth to defend herself, but Vincenzo held up a hand. I'm not finished talking. The authority in his voice was absolute. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, and everyone in the room felt it. You told my daughter she was bad. You told her she was difficult. You isolated her from her classmates. You humiliated her in front of other children. You fed her garbage and called it discipline. Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson was backing away now, bumping into the lunch table behind her. You targeted my child. My innocent, sweet 8-year-old daughter who lost her mother 2 years ago and is still learning how to navigate the world without her. Isabella had stopped crying and was watching her father with wide eyes. She'd never seen him like this before. Not angry, exactly, but something far more dangerous. He was speaking in the same tone he used when he was about to make someone disappear, but he wasn't done. Not even close. The question now, Mrs. Patterson, is what we're going to do about this situation. Because you've made a very serious mistake. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Mrs. Patterson's hands were shaking now, and she kept glancing toward the cafeteria exit like she was calculating her chances of making a run for it. But Vincenzo wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. You see, Mrs. Patterson, in my line of work, I deal with all kinds of people. People who steal, people who lie, people who hurt others for their own twisted pleasure. And I've learned something very important over the years. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the cafeteria, every word carried perfectly. The most dangerous people aren't the ones who come at you with guns or knives. The most dangerous people are the ones who hurt children and think they can hide behind their authority. Mrs. Patterson's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. Sweat beads formed on her forehead despite the air conditioning. Mr. DeLuca, please let me explain. Isabella is a challenging child. She requires firm guidance. Sometimes teaching methods might seem harsh to parents who don't understand. Shut up. The words were spoken so quietly they were almost inaudible, but the effect was immediate. Mrs. Patterson's mouth snapped closed like she'd been slapped. You're going to listen now, because I'm only going to say this once. Vincenzo pulled out his phone and began scrolling through it. I made some calls on my way over here. Very interesting what you can learn about a person when you know where to look. Mrs. Patterson's face went from pale to gray. Turns out this isn't the first time you've had problems with students, is it? Lincoln Elementary, 2018. A little boy named Tommy Martinez. Remember him? The teacher's eyes went wide. That was completely different. That child had severe behavioral issues. 7 years old. Same age as Isabella was when this started. According to the records I found, Tommy's parents complained that you were singling him out, making him eat lunch alone, giving him different food from the other children. Sound familiar? Mrs. Patterson started backing toward the wall. Those allegations were never proven. The investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing. Right, no evidence. Because Tommy's family didn't have the resources to fight the school district, they transferred him to another school and hoped for the best. Vincenzo continued scrolling. Then there was Madison Elementary in 2015. A little girl named Sarah Chen. Her parents filed a complaint that you were emotionally abusing their daughter, making her stand in the corner during lunch, telling her she was stupid in front of other children. Each revelation hit like a hammer blow. The other teachers in the cafeteria were staring at Mrs. Patterson with growing horror and disgust. The Chen family was told their daughter was being dramatic, that sometimes children exaggerate when they don't want to face consequences for their behavior. They were made to feel like they were the problem. Mrs. Patterson was pressed against the wall now, looking desperately around the room for support. But the faces staring back at her showed nothing but revulsion. Should I keep going? Because there are more. Oh, there are so many more. 22 years of targeting children who couldn't fight back. 22 years of hiding behind your teaching license while you tortured kids for your own sick pleasure. That's not true, Mrs. Patterson whispered. I'm a good teacher. I've won awards. I've been recognized for excellence. You've been recognized for keeping quiet, for not making waves, for being the kind of teacher administrators love because you never cause problems for them. But you know what they say about people who seem too good to be true. Vincenzo put his phone away and turned to address the entire cafeteria. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Ladies and gentlemen, children, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say. This woman has been abusing children for over 2 decades. Not just my daughter, not just a few isolated incidents. This has been a pattern of systematic cruelty that the school system has covered up and ignored. The cafeteria manager, Carol, stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. DeLuca, with all due respect, those are very serious accusations. Perhaps we should call the principal. The principal already knows. The words hit the room like a bomb. Several teachers gasped audibly. You think I came here unprepared? You think I walked into this situation blind? I've been making phone calls all morning. To parents, to former students, to people who tried to report Mrs. Patterson's behavior and were silenced. He pulled out a thick folder from inside his coat. 47 families over the past 15 years. 47 children who were targeted, abused, and humiliated by this woman. And 47 times, the school district buried the complaints. Mrs. Patterson was openly crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who knew their world was about to come crashing down. Principal Morrison has been transferred to 3 different schools in the past decade. Want to guess why? Every time parents start asking too many questions about certain teachers, he gets moved to a new district before investigations can gain momentum. The folder hit the table with a heavy thud. But here's the thing about power, Mrs. Patterson. Real power isn't about intimidating children or hiding behind bureaucracy. Real power is about having the resources to uncover the truth and make sure justice gets served. Isabella, who had been watching this entire exchange in stunned silence, tugged on her father's sleeve. Daddy, what's happening? Vincenzo knelt down beside his daughter, his voice becoming gentle again. What's happening, sweetheart, is that some very bad people have been hurting children for a long time, and now everyone knows the truth. He stood back up and fixed Mrs. Patterson with a stare that could have melted steel. Here's what's going to happen next. You're going to walk out of this cafeteria. You're going to pack up your classroom. And you're never going to set foot in another school again. You can't do that, Mrs. Patterson said, though her voice lacked any conviction. The school board has to. The school board is about to have much bigger problems to worry about, because this story is going to be on every news channel in the state by tomorrow morning, along with the names of every administrator who helped cover this up. Vincenzo turned to the other teachers in the room. How many of you knew what was happening? How many of you saw children being abused and said nothing? The silence was deafening. Several teachers looked down at their feet, unable to meet his eyes. I understand fear. I understand not wanting to rock the boat. But when children are being hurt, there is no excuse for silence. Mrs. Patterson made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Mr. DeLuca, surely we can work something out. I have a family. I have bills to pay. This job is all I have. The look Vincenzo gave her could have stopped a charging bull. You should have thought about that before you decided to torture 8-year-olds. He turned back to Isabella. who was still sitting at the table with the ruined food in front of her. "Come on, baby. We're leaving." "But what about lunch? Mrs. Patterson says I have to finish everything on my tray." "Mrs. Patterson doesn't get to tell you what to do anymore. Nobody gets to treat you like that ever again." As they walked toward the cafeteria exit, Vincenzo stopped and addressed the room one final time. "To the children who are listening to this, I want you to remember something very important. No adult has the right to hurt you, humiliate you, or make you feel ashamed of who you are. And if someone does hurt you, you tell someone. You keep telling until someone listens." He looked directly at Mrs. Patterson. "And, to the adults in this room who failed these children, you better hope I never find out you were part of this cover-up. Because unlike the school board, I don't believe in second chances when it comes to people who hurt kids." The cafeteria doors swung shut behind them, leaving Mrs. Patterson standing alone in a room full of people who were looking at her like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock. But Vincenzo's work was just beginning. As Vincenzo and Isabella walked through the school hallways, word spread like wildfire. Teachers whispered in doorways. Office staff made frantic phone calls. Students pressed their faces against classroom windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had just destroyed their teacher's career with nothing but the truth. But the real earthquake was just beginning. Within hours of leaving the school, Vincenzo's phone started ringing. The first call came from Maria Santos, a mother he'd never met. Her voice was shaking as she spoke. "Mr. DeLuca, I heard what happened today. My son Diego was in Mrs. Patterson's class 3 years ago. She did the same thing to him, made him eat spoiled food, isolated him from other kids, told him he was worthless. When I complained to the principal, they said Diego was lying to get attention." The second call came from James Chen, Sarah's father. "I should have fought harder for my daughter. When the school told us Sarah was being dramatic, we believed them. We thought maybe we were overreacting. I've regretted that decision every day for 8 years." By evening, Vincenzo had received 43 phone calls, 43 families, 43 children who had suffered in silence while the adults who were supposed to protect them looked the other way. That night, as Isabella slept peacefully for the first time in months, Vincenzo sat in his study making a different kind of plan than usual. This wasn't about territory or business deals. This was about justice for children who had no voice and parents who had been silenced by a corrupt system. He called his lawyer, Anthony Ricci, the best attorney money could buy. "Tony, I need you to file lawsuits against the school district. Not just one, dozens. Every family that was ignored, every complaint that was buried, every child who was hurt while administrators covered it up." "Vincenzo, that's going to be expensive. We're talking about millions in legal fees alone." "I don't care about the money. These people hurt my daughter. They hurt dozens of children. And they thought they could get away with it because they were dealing with families who didn't have the resources to fight back." 3 days later, the story broke on every major news outlet in the state. Mafia boss exposes school abuse scandal. Teacher's 20-year reign of terror ends. How one father's love brought down a corrupt system. The footage from the cafeteria security cameras was devastating. Parents across the country watched in horror as Mrs. Patterson systematically humiliated child after child, year after year. The images of Isabella sitting alone, crying over spoiled food, sparked outrage that reached the highest levels of government. Principal Morrison was arrested at his home on charges of conspiracy to cover up child abuse. Superintendent Williams resigned in disgrace. The entire school board was voted out in an emergency election. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during a packed school board meeting 2 weeks later. Vincenzo stood at the podium, Isabella holding his hand, facing a room full of parents, teachers, and community members. "People ask me why I got involved. They say a man like me should stay out of school business. But I want you all to understand something very clearly. I am many things. I have made choices in my life that some of you might not agree with. But above all else, I am a father." His voice echoed through the silent auditorium. "When my daughter came home crying, when she stopped eating, when she started having nightmares, I could have transferred her to private school. I could have moved her away from the problem. But that wouldn't have helped the next child, or the one after that." Isabella squeezed his hand tighter. She was wearing a new dress. Her hair was braided with ribbons, and for the first time in months, she was smiling. Mrs. Patterson preyed on children whose families she thought were powerless, immigrant families who were afraid to speak up, single mothers working 3 jobs who didn't have time to fight the system, families who trusted that educators had their children's best interests at heart. He paused, looking directly at the camera crews recording the meeting. She was wrong about powerlessness, because when you hurt a child, you create an enemy for life, and some enemies have the resources to make sure justice gets served. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous ovation. Parents who had lost faith in the system were seeing hope for the first time in years. But Vincenzo wasn't finished. He had one more surprise that would change everything. "My legal team has established the Isabella De Luca Foundation for Child Protection. We're providing free legal representation to any family whose child has been abused by school personnel. We're funding independent investigations into districts with suspicious patterns of complaints. And we're offering rewards for information about educators who target vulnerable children." The foundation's first case came from across the state. A teacher in Riverside had been forcing students to clean toilets as punishment. Another case involved a coach who was withholding water from players during practice. Stories that had been buried for years suddenly had a voice. Mrs. Patterson, meanwhile, had disappeared entirely. Some said she'd moved out of state. Others claimed she was working at a fast food restaurant under a different name. But her teaching career was over forever, and her name had become synonymous with everything wrong with unchecked authority. 3 months after the cafeteria incident, Isabella started at a new school. Vincenzo personally interviewed every teacher, every administrator, every staff member who would have contact with his daughter. He established a parent committee to monitor lunch programs and classroom behavior. He installed cameras in common areas with parent access to the feeds. Some called it overkill. Vincenzo called it necessary. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't violence or intimidation. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let injustice hide in the shadows. Vincenzo De Luca proved that a father's love can move mountains and tear down corrupt systems that prey on the innocent. Mrs. Patterson thought she was untouchable, protected by bureaucracy and silence. She was wrong. Today, Isabella laughs at lunch with friends, eating fresh food, surrounded by teachers who actually care. And 47 other families finally have the justice they deserved. Because when you hurt a child, you don't just anger a parent. You awaken something far more dangerous than any criminal organization. You awaken the truth.